Hello and welcome to this webinar of the Energy Future Exchange Effects. It's a transatlantic civil society dialogue with partners from Europe and the United States. We are very glad to have this opportunity here today to offer you a webinar on the topic of sustainable baseload energy for remote communities. My name is Max Grunig from the Ecologic Institute. We're one of the 3 project partners in the Energy Future Exchange, alongside with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy and alongside the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. I'm very happy to have here today with us Monty Worthington and Guillaume Marcaille. They're both working for ORPC and will be presenting here today, but they work from different locations. Monty is in Alaska, so it's a very early call for him today. Very happy that you made it here. It's this early hour of the day. And Guillaume is in Canada and in Montreal, representing the French-speaking part, but the whole webinar will be in English, I've been informed, so this will be a compromise here. We will have a recording of the webinar available for those of you who either can't be available for the whole duration of the webinar or who join in later. And we usually manage to have time for questions and answers after the presentation. So this is our aim. I don't want to take up more of your time of the speakers and of the participants. And I'll hand over to Monty right away if you're ready.
Sure, and thanks for the introduction. So my name is Monty Worthington, and I work as the Director of Project Development in Alaska for Ocean Renewable Power Company. I've been here about 10 years. Our company started in 2004, so we've been around a little while. And we develop tidal energy and hydrokinetic technology and projects. And I'll give Guillaume a chance to introduce himself here before we get started.
Hello everyone. Yeah, my name is Guillaume Marcaille. I work for the ORPC Canada branch as a project manager for a different Canadian project here in Canada, in Quebec, and even across it. So I joined ORPC almost 1 year ago now, and it's a great challenge.
Great, thanks, Guillaume. So I'll go ahead and get started here, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk a bit about what our company does with you all this morning, and look forward to a discussion. So just a bit of background on ORPC. ORPC was started back in 2004, and our headquarters are in Portland, Maine. You can see these blue bubbles there on the map of the portion of the globe there that show where our offices are. We have office in Montreal, where Guillaume is based. Also, we have a office in Ireland and one here in Anchorage. We do have an employee who's based in Seattle as well. And we have about 28 employees right now. And our core expertise is in underwater power system technology development, harnessing currents primarily, not wave energy, but tidal currents, and also river currents is the other area where we work. And I'll talk quite a bit about that today. So that's one of the areas that we've really moved into in Alaska in the remote communities here. And one of the big reasons that we have an office in Montreal to work in the areas of Northern Canada, and Guillaume will talk a bit about that. So moving along here. So we did actually a lot of work re-envisioning our company's mission statement this year, and I'm not going to read it to you, but it speaks for itself in sort of the core values of our company, why we all come to work here and choose to do this as a profession. The picture there is actually a picture from Igiagig, Alaska, and it's a community I'm going to talk a lot about later in this presentation. It's a remote community about 200 miles from Anchorage. That's there's no road access, and those are some of the children in the village talking with our engineer, Ryan Tyler, who's based in Seattle, looking at our first iteration of our RivGen power system that we deployed there. But our business model is really oriented on working with communities to find solutions to their energy needs, and really approaching that as a partnership with whatever customers or communities we're working with. And largely right now, it's focused on remote communities, and I'll talk a lot about that as we move forward here. So our company has been working steadily to develop our underwater turbine technology. We've done 11 successful marine renewable energy. That's what the MRE stands for there, Marine Renewable Energy Project, since 2007. That's about the time I joined the company. And there's some highlights there along our development. In 2008, we had something we call our Beta TGU project. And our TGU is our turbine generator unit. And that is basically the turbines and the generator that sit underwater and are a core component of our power system. There are other pieces to the entire power system that include the transmission that brings the power to shore and the power conditioning equipment on shore and the bottom attachment systems. But the TGU is really our core technology and something we've evolved several iterations of. You can see that 2012 image is of our first TiGen TGU, and it has 4 turbines and a single generator in the center, still is referred to as our TGU. And then in 2015, that turbine generator unit there is part of our RivGen device, and that's what you'd seen on the beach in the previous image, and that's it sitting on the surface of the river in Igiagig prior to being sunk to the bottom and deployed there. So we've been really continuously developing this TGU technology along with the rest of the power system, and have really leveraged our work in the tidal environments to enhance our river technology development and vice versa. And right now our company is on a strong effort to deploy our next generation RivGen technology, which we'll talk about more moving forward. So this is just a little bit about our next generation of technology that's under development. You can see there's the RivGen there in the center is being built as we speak and will be in Alaska to be deployed this summer. And to give a bit of a sense of scale there, that RivGen is about 40 feet across as you're looking at it there. And the TiGen 8 is designed to be a utility scale turbine and has not been completed design or built yet. And the TiGen 4 is a tidal turbine that's more designed for these remote communities that we'll talk a lot about that are dependent on high cost of power, largely from diesel generation. This is a cross-flow turbine technology, and so that's different from an axial flow, which is more of a traditional wind turbine you would see with a 3-bladed wind turbine would be referred to as an axial flow turbine in this context. The flow flows across our direction of rotation. So we call those cross flow turbines. There's a single drive shaft. There's no generator. We've really focused on maximum reliability and durability with this technology. So we've tried to minimize the moving parts, and really there's essentially one moving part, the shaft that connects to that rotor of the generator and spins that rotor directly. It's got a very low vertical profile, which is one of the reasons this adapts well to rivers that don't tend to be super deep. And so that's been a real advantage of us, is that aspect ratio that fits well in a river cross section. And we've really focused on these being easy to install, maintain, and minimizing the life cycle costs. And we have 24 patents that support this technology at this point. So I'm going to step right into a bit about the market where we're working. When I started with the company's focus was really on trying to develop a utility grid scale technology, sort of a megawatt scale technology. And as we started working here in Alaska, Cook Inlet was the focus, where we have strong tides and it's close to our regional utility grid that serves the majority of the population of Alaska. However, as we saw that there was a lot of opportunities in the remote communities in Alaska where people pay a lot for power, much more than they do, sometimes 10 times as much as here in Anchorage, because they're dependent on diesel that is either barged or flown in. And we realized it as we were developing our technology and our costs were higher than could compete with a large-scale utility grid. This might be a good market where we could serve a need and meet the price point that they were currently paying for power. And as we started investigating this, at first it became obvious there weren't a lot of these opportunities outside of Alaska and the US. But as you look into Canada, there's a lot of opportunities. We'll talk about that. And worldwide, it's a bit surprising, but a little over 700 million people depend on diesel as their primary fuel for electrical generation. And another 1.3 billion people have no access to a reliable electrical grid. And all these communities are facing sustainability issues related to the economics of burning diesel, but also the environmental risks of transporting, storing diesel in their communities. And there's a lot of motivation to try to figure out other ways to generate electricity that don't necessarily involve extending a major power grid to these locations. So it's a very meaningful market. You know, nearly a quarter of the people on the planet are in this situation. We feel that our power systems could be a key component of the transition from fossil fuel-based generation to renewable-based generation. So some of the value propositions of sustainable energy as opposed and renewable energy in these communities is to reduce and stabilize the cost of electricity. When we're dependent on a fossil fuel source, where these communities are really at the mercy of the markets and the volatility of those prices, which we all know are very difficult to predict. It also, when we look at how we use electricity, if we're flying fuel into a village to power their generation, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to consider using it for other things like heat or especially transportation, where we can use the fuel directly to power vehicles. But if we start using renewable energy, it kind of takes those limits away. It starts to make sense to look at electric vehicles and things like that. There's also the benefit we all know of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And while this population base might not feel they're having an impact on a global scale, it enables them to not feel like they're part of the problem that often is heavily impacting these northern communities, especially. And we see that in Alaska, where the impacts of climate change are especially exacerbated in these small communities. And on the local level, it really reduces the environmental risks associated with diesel fuel. I was just out in Igiagig, the community where we're working, last week, and throughout we had a community meeting, and again, people from the leadership down to community members highlighted the fact they want to get away from burning diesel. They have the largest salmon run in the world going up the Kwijak River next to their community, and they have a huge diesel tank farm that they have to store their fuel right on the edge of the river. And at one time, it nearly eroded the bank and toppled into the river. And when they bring fuel, when the fuel is not flown in and brought up the river, they have to transload it at least once within the river. And it's something they just see as a huge risk to their environment, and they want to get away from it. And there's also a great opportunity for local economic development. Rather than buying fuel for electricity, the local contractors can play a part in the maintenance of these devices, which is really the large long-term cost of these. So rather than money flowing straight out of the economy, it can support local businesses. So there's a lot of value propositions to this, to using renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels. As we look at marine renewable energy, again, this takes different terminology in different countries. Actually, in the United States, we call this marine hydrokinetic (MHK) technology, and it includes in that terminology and in marine renewable energy, tidal energy, river energy, also that is not using a dam or impoundment, like river hydrokinetic is included in that, and also wave energy is included in that term. So far, we've, some of the advantages of this include it being completely underwater, so there's no view shed issues. It's very predictable as opposed to other renewable energy generation sources, whether you're in a tidal environment where it's going to a peak and a minimum several times a day, but we're very predictable, or in the case of river energy, where we see that it's not only predictable, but very stable over the course of many days. There's also no known adverse impacts we've documented to the marine environment. We've done extensive studies and continue to. We're doing an extensive fish study this summer that I can talk more about. These remote communities that we're looking at in Alaska and northern Canada right now, and also down in Chile to some extent, often have strong tidal currents nearby. It seems like someone might need to mute their microphone. There's some background noise. Thanks. And yeah, so there's tidal and river opportunities in a lot of these remote communities. In Alaska, all of our remote communities are co-located where there were traditional villages, and these traditional villages were either on the coast or on a river large enough for salmon to migrate up, with the exception of 2 out of about 200 villages that fit that requirement, and it means there's a good chance that there's either river currents, tidal currents, or perhaps wave energy resources near these communities. So it has quite a bit of replicability in this market. At this point, I'm going to hand this presentation over to Guillaume, and he's going to talk about the market space and a little bit about Canada as well and how that looks there.
Thank you, Marty. Yeah, indeed, I will just present a few slides for the market worldwide, and then focus on some specific region such as Canada and North America and Alaska. And I will give back the floor to Monty presenting for EAGIG project in much more detail. So on this slide, we have the U.S. National Research Council divided the market for marine renewable energy production in 3 different categories. The first one is the theoretical resource, which is the annual average amount of energy available in the world. In other words, the upper limit of the market, basically. The second category is the extractable, the technical extractable resource, based on the technology and technology feasibility and efficiency. And the third one, Monty, we lost the presentation.
Yes, I was just going to say.
And the third category is the practical extractable, based on today's context, social, economical, and environmental, especially. So now, if we break down some figures there, we see that we around the world we have opportunity of 433 gigawatts, which is basically split into river, tidal, and ocean current energy. But with today's technology and efficiency, only a quarter of that can be technically extractable. So meaning that we have an efficiency between 5 and 50% between the source of power, river, tidal, or ocean current. And even that, with the social, economical, and environmental context as per today, we only have 46 available worldwide. Now take that figure, if you can just move to the next one. Now take that figure of 46 gigawatt. Interesting to know at what is the cost of production this energy. Indeed, the cost of producing 1 unit of electricity will open or close some markets on some areas. It is obvious that the lower the cost is, the bigger the market is. The graph here on this slide shows that completely that above a price above 30 cents per kilowatt hour, we only have 1.5 gigawatts open and available on the world. And if the cost drops between 20 and 30 cents per kilowatt hour, then we open 20 more gigawatts. And it's the same thing with a price dropping under 20 cents. So it's really important then and it's a great challenge for the industry to minimize and reduce the cost as much as possible to open widely and be present all over the world. Yeah, you can switch to evaluate precisely the cost of energy. We have the LCOE. LCOE is an indicator for all kind of technology, solar, wind, tidal, and even fuel and so on. LCOE means levelized cost of electricity. This is the net present value of the unit cost of electricity over the lifetime of generating assets. Sometimes, in other words, it's often taken as a proxy, basically, for the average price that generating assets must receive in the market to break even over its lifetime. So it's a critical parameter to know if it's economically interesting to move with this technology or not. What we can see from the figures here is the start point for the tidal energy, and start LCOE figure is lower than wind and solar. And more the technology can become matures when the more efficient and so on, the LCOE cost reduce, and the prediction gives within 15 years a cost of almost 10 cents per kilowatt. Within 4 years, so if we look at the number 4 on the X line, the cost will reach 40 cents per kilowatt-hour. This amount, this value, will open remote communities market. As Monty said, bringing diesel to the community as a cost is then it becomes interesting in this way. Now, as for ORPC technology, ReefGen and TideGen, the LCOE cost dropped year after year and reached now an average of 65 cents per kilowatt-hour. So we are still at the beginning of the process, and cost will reduce with time, with maturation of the technology. But which is interesting to note is at the end, in the futures, the cost for tidal energy will be very interesting compared to solar and wind. You can. Now, if we look more specifically into region and North America first, and then I will slide after to Canada. In Alaska, there are almost 80,000 people, in Canada 200,000 people living in isolated or remote communities, which the electricity is relying on diesel mainly, provoking the burning of 27 million gallons in Alaska and almost 30 million gallons in Canada annually. It's obvious to guess that burning this amount of fuel emits a lot of CO2 emission in the atmospheres, and as again Monty said, have a lot of cost of bringing the diesel to the communities. So if we look at the Canada now more specifically, just Monty, move to the next one. Merci. Thank you very much. There are nearly 300 remote and isolated communities across Canada, in BC, Northwest Territories, and even Quebec and East Maritimes provinces. All these communities are using, as you can see the numbers, 1,500 gigawatt hours of electricity. To produce this heat and this electricity, we need to burn 950 million of liters of diesel. So it releases a lot of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and it brings some risk as well, so environmental risk. This is obvious by the numbers here, and also cost and social development as well, because we bring something to the community instead of making the community working and developing its own producing device. So having an MRI solution such as ORPC technology will lower the cost and increase the availability of electricity within the remote communities, and also bring down the emission of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and can bring as well some economic development. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Guillaume. That was great. So I'll move on here. So stepping back to Alaska, where I am, this is a map of our state, and these dots show the location of a lot of our remote communities within the state, and the rivers, they're in blue, and then the coastline is shown with the wave resource in the shades of green, and it's hard to see the tidal resources because they're so localized, but there's Cook Inlet is shown here. There's some of the tidal resources, and there's other blue spots around the state that are really hard to see, but because they're so local. But it gives a sense of where these resources are, the size of the community by the size of the dot, and then the cost of power by how yellow or red it is. And you can see how much red there is there, which is paid more than 50 cents a kilowatt hour for power, which is higher than the graph that Guillaume showed within 4 years getting down to 40 cents. So we really look at that 40 cent a kilowatt hour price point as a really crucial price point in our technologies and projects development. And that's when we really start to meet or beat the price of diesel electricity in so many remote communities. So we offer stability and economic incentive. In Alaska, we have about 80,000 people in these remote communities burning 27 million gallons, 102 million liters of fuel, diesel fuel each year for electricity. So there's a lot of fuel use to address here. So I'm going to go ahead and step into a really specific example to kind of bring some reality to this. This is a picture of Igiagig. Most of the community is there on the right-hand side of the river. It's the Kwijak River. They sit on there, and that body of water is Lake Iliamna. It's the largest lake in Alaska. It's about 80 miles across to the far shore, and it's drained by the Kwijak River here. And as I said, most of the community is shown there. You can see the runway where the diesel fuel is flown in. There's a small portion of the community off this map, but it's only about 80 people who live there year round. So it's quite a small community, and they pay upwards, well, their price before government subsidies is over 80 cents a kilowatt hour for power. So it's in a significantly expensive market. We're going to show some pictures of our RivGen project, which is located right here. If you can see my mouse, just downstream of this island is where we've chosen to develop this project. So this is a picture of our RivGen power system on the surface of the river in 2015. We did a 2-year demonstration with the community, deploying our system in 2014 over the summer, and then making some improvements that winter time, and then redeploying it in 2015 and proving out our technology and assessing the community's interest in a long-term project there. And it was really well received and very successful project. We had a lot of public funding that went into this. The state of Alaska's Energy Authority had a Renewable Energy Fund grant that the Igiagig Village Council received to sort of set up a test bed for hydrokinetic technologies. And the Emerging Energy Technology Fund, over a couple rounds funded, which is also a state of Alaska program, funded ORPC to build this RivGen technology and deploy it at the site. We also had support from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Small Business Innovation and Research Program and the U.S. Department of Energy as the project progressed. And there was a lot of private match to this funding as well. And there's a really good piece that a local news station did that I'm not going to show here because it's a video. We know those don't work well, but it's available on our website. You can find it, and it gives a good sense about the project and what it entailed. And this was done in concurrence when actually the president Obama at the time and Secretary of State John Kerry were up in Alaska for some conferences and visits when we were deploying, and it kind of ties in their visit and our focus on addressing climate change to this project. And we were awarded the National Hydropower Association Outstanding Stewards of American Waters Award for this, which was the first time a non-traditional hydro, a marine energy company, received this honor. So it was a very successful project, and we've leveraged that success to move towards the next generation commercial version of this technology that we intend to deploy this summer. So going back to our sort of value proposition, you can see this image here is with those are all ORPC and local contractors who work together to build, to assemble, to test and deploy this system. And this really ties into our value proposition of locally produced renewable electricity, significantly reducing environmental risks, and very importantly, creating local sustainable economic development. And the community of Igiagig really saw this. We only brought in specialized contractors for a couple very specific tasks, such as licensed electricians to do electrical interconnects. But all the heavy equipment, all the marine assets were operated by local operators and owned by local businesses. And it really created a lot of economic development even within the demonstration. And it was very clear to the community that if we could start producing energy this way rather than with diesel, we don't just have this money flowing out of the community on fuel bills, but yet more circularly, more of a circular economy where our local contractors are the ones who are maintaining it, and that's where the bulk of our electrical costs come from. So some of the achievements of this project, we delivered community to a local diesel-powered microgrid. When we were operating, we were supplying about 1/3 of their electricity needs. We made significant technology improvements, improving our performance by about 30% between the 2 years. We proved self-deploying and self-retrieving aspects of this device, and the way that works is you can see it sitting on the surface there on its pontoons, these steel pontoons, and we essentially, via an umbilical, what we call an umbilical, that is air and water hoses, you can see streaming behind it here, we flood these pontoons with water to sink it to the riverbed, and it goes completely out of sight while it's in operation. And when it's time to do any maintenance or removal, we deballast that by forcing pressurized air, and it pushes the water out and refloats the device. And it eliminated the need for anything such as cranes or really heavy lift capability to install and retrieve the device, and proved very effective. So moving forward, we decommissioned that demonstration project, and we're now looking at a more long-term project. And this image here basically shows the footprint of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license application that the Igiugig Village Council submitted in November. And this is for permission to deploy up to 2 RivGen devices and interconnect them to the local grid. We anticipate, if there aren't any issues, which it appears everything is going well, that this license would be issued by the beginning of April this year, and provide those permissions along with some other permits and that are underway. To give a sense of this, we produced 1/3 of the power with our demonstration project. We anticipate one of these devices will now be producing almost half the energy the community needs, half the power they need at any given time, and 2 devices will really move towards producing most of the power most of the time that they need. So this begins to look more like their base load, and the diesel becomes more of a backup. And there's also efforts to install more wind capacity in the community and solar, that and energy storage. And between all of those, we're starting to look at something where we can turn the diesels off, which would be a novel and an important step, as it really increases the value proposition, not just to throttle back the diesel generators, but to actually turn them off and eliminate a lot of the ongoing costs of operating those diesels. So just to bring a sense of reality to this was just some pictures from last week. This next generation device, RivGen device, is being assembled in Brunswick, Maine, in a hangar there. And we're going to fully assemble it, make sure all the components interface well, and once that is done, it'll all be disassembled, packaged on trailers, and shipped to Alaska, and hopefully be arriving here sometime in late April, early May for its shipment out to Igiugig. And one of the aspects of this project I should point out is remote logistics were a really important part of this. Because we're trying to work with remote communities, we need to make sure that we can get our equipment out to these remote communities without exorbitant costs and deploy it. The self-deploying and self-retrieving was essential for that, but also the way this is designed, it is meant to be taken apart in components that will fit on standard truck trailers, so that it can be shipped intermodally, both overland, and to get to Igiugig, it will go overland across the US, it will get on a ship, it will go from Seattle to Anchorage, it will go overland from Anchorage to Homer, Alaska, it will get on another ship, it will cross Cook Inlet to Williamsport, it will get on a truck again, be hauled up a 18-mile dirt road to Lake Iliamna, and then yet again be put on a barge to be delivered to Igiugig. So it's an incredible test of the intermodal capabilities of the design, and so far has been, in our demonstration, was successful, and we've stuck to the same criteria for making sure this was shippable to these remote communities. I wanted to take just a minute to talk about sustainable microgrids and smart grids. It's a concept that we're hearing a lot about these days. And this microgrids are often referred to not in the context of an isolated microgrid like I'll be talking about here, but in a sort of a portion of a larger utility grid. And the idea that by providing distributed generation, we can provide some resiliency to that portion of a larger grid. In this case, I'm going to be talking largely just about a microgrid that is truly isolated, like Igiugig and like these remote communities in Alaska and northern Canada that we're talking about. And so this is essentially a grid that's confined to a specific geographic area and completely integrates the electrical generation and the loads and in one contained system, and doesn't have the ability to import or export power. And that's important because it creates some challenges. Some of the benefits of these, that come along with microgrids when we integrate renewables, is that we can stabilize energy costs. We can additionally reduce the cost of energy as we realize efficiencies in technologies, economic efficiencies. There's a big increase in reliability and resiliency. This is something when I heard from the community of Igiugig about their desire to get away from diesel, they brought up the fact that they can only fly diesel during the summertime when the runway is very stable. They're stuck with the price of whatever diesel is in the summer, which is often more expensive than winter. And if there ends up being any sort of break in that supply chain, such as the 1 or 2 companies that operate planes that are actually aging DC-3 planes that can deliver this fuel, they don't have any other way to generate electricity. So resiliency is really important. As we diversify our energy supply, we get away from strict dependence on one type of energy. Improved environmental outcomes with less environmental risk is, of course, an obvious one. Greater energy choice in terms of what we can use. We can now look at using solar, wind, marine hydrokinetic, and different technologies. Increase of local energy, which has economic opportunities I talked about, and again, diversification, which plays into that resiliency component. So some of the challenges of these microgrids, where we're generating in a space where we don't have the ability to export or import power, is we always have a variable load, and that's what's shown in green here, an example of a load of what a load might look like through the day. And you can see while its baseline level is not very high in this graph, it has peaks periodically. Maybe it's when everyone wakes up and turns on their lights in the morning and starts making toast, or when everyone comes home and is cooking dinner. And so with diesel generation, we end up either operating the diesel fairly inefficiently as it tries to follow this load, or even more inefficiently as we just produce a steady power and spinning reserve, and always try to have enough power in spinning reserve to meet those peaks when they show up. There's some different examples of what different energy sources look like over the course of the day. Wind energy, kind of very unpredictable and hard to match to the load. Solar really peaking during one part of the day that doesn't always match those load peaks. But marine renewable energy, especially river, which is what is emulated here, is basically steady. There is noise on the output due to turbulence in the river, plus or minus 10%. But over the course of the day, we see a really steady output that we can really plan around. And as we look at integrating energy storage, we can really start to use the dips in the load to charge energy storage that can then be used to meet the peak demands. And that's how we're looking at moving to a baseload energy source here. And so this sort of shows the components of what we need in terms of a microgrid, a resilient microgrid. And here is this battery energy storage, which becomes really critical. The marine renewable energy can provide a consistent load, but it can't on its own meet the peaks if they're more than it's outputting. And if we install enough marine renewable energy to meet those peaks, it means most of the time we're having to spill most of that energy. Diesel still becomes an important part for it's proved to be a resilient system and can always be a backup when things go wrong. We know they're very reliable, and we can look at bringing other resources in, such as wind and solar, to help augment and have a different output profile than the marine renewable energy and lead to more resiliency. And this sort of shows a graph here of sort of what the load looks like over time. The load is shown in red here, and also again in this diesel contribution is shown, just following that load, providing what it needs at any given time. Here we see what marine hydrokinetics would look like, and you get a sense about how much it could cut down on this diesel usage. And in this case, instead of the diesel matching this load up here, it's dropped down to almost zero at times, and just needing to meet the peaks. And this is just with marine hydrokinetics, not energy storage. We estimate a single 35 kilowatt rated RivGen power system at 81% availability, meaning it was operating 81% of the time, in the village of Igiagi even could displace nearly 25,000 gallons of diesel, which is a significant amount of fuel if you imagine all the barrels that stacks up to. But when we integrate energy storage, it starts to look very different. And this is a graph of a week in January 2016 of a very simplified modeling that basically has been improved upon since then over a couple iterations of more sophisticated modeling. But looking at what was the village's load, how much would the diesel need to operate if the RivGen was continuously operating for this time? And we see here without energy storage, the diesel has to always, we can never turn it off because we always need it there to provide the stability to the voltage and frequency and to meet those peaks when they show up. And you can't just turn it on instantly to meet peaks. It has to be running so it can ramp up to do that. But if we had energy storage that same week, we end up only needing to turn that diesel on at certain times when the load peaks above what the energy storage and the RivGen can provide. And this is where the dramatic increase in economics happen. Not only do we have an inefficient diesel that's running at 10 kilowatt hours, 10 kilowatts, producing power the whole time and burning fuel, we have all the maintenance associated with that operation and not really needing that energy, just needing it as a backup. Now when we have energy storage, suddenly we just turn it on when it's needed and when the load is not manageable reliably by the renewables and the energy storage. So wanted to move to just talking a little bit about the sort of economic impact and leave some time for questions here. This is a map of Maine and a list of the companies that our company has worked with to implement our projects in Maine and support our operations there. It's obviously very extensive. We as a company are not trying to fill all the niches. If we move into an area and there's a local business that can do what we need done, we would much rather just support them in doing that work rather than trying to have to bring that capacity on ourselves. Here in Alaska, similarly, we've had an extensive amount of businesses we've worked with. You can see in the community of Igiagig, that just has 80 people, there's a list of almost eight businesses that we've supported, which in a small community is huge. And some of these are quite significant contracts for the work we've done there. But we've had a significant impact in the state and continue to. A lot of these businesses in the Kenai Peninsula and in Anchorage are really in support of this project and the supply chain for the remote communities within Alaska. So with that, decided to leave you with a couple quotes from Alexandra Salmon, who's the young president of the Igiagig Village Council, and she's a real visionary leader for Igiagig, but also for remote communities everywhere in Alaska. And they have really, she saw early on the value of moving away from diesel into renewables, and they invited us out there first in 2011 to consider participating in their hydrokinetic test bed. And since then, have really developed a strong partnership with the Igiagig Village Council, and they really see the vision of moving towards this sustainable energy future. It ties into their long-term vision. When she became president and she was in her early 20s, they had a long-term visioning exercise as a community with the elders of the community, and it really highlighted their focus on wanting to become more independent and more sustainable. And they realized that in the lifetime of those elders, they had moved away from that. When the elders were young, they were completely sustainable. They had a much simpler way of life, but it was sustainable. Now they have a modern way of life, and it's unsustainable, and they want to go back to that sustainability being a core value, cultural value that they've always considered important. So we're hoping to help them with that and continue to be partners with them long into the future. And with that, that's the end of our presentation, and I hope you have some time for some discussion.
Thank you very much, Monty and Guillaume. It was really, really interesting. I'm very thrilled of all the benefits you show, and I know I want to give the floor to participants here to ask questions, and maybe I can shoot here a very first question as a follow-up to both of you, Monty and Guillaume. What do you think is the biggest obstacle or barrier to uptake of your technology, given that it is advantages in these diesel communities, given the many benefits it has? Why is it not being more implemented?
That's a really good question, and so I'll offer one. There's a few things that come to mind, but I would say that I think the thing that I see as being one of the biggest challenges is, as a new technology, first-time costs are just expensive. We're not at a point yet where we compete with this diesel market on our first project, and so we needed a partner who saw the bigger picture, that this didn't need to be cheaper than diesel on your first turbine you install. Hopefully, and as we have with Igiagig, we found some public funding to absorb a lot of those costs. But we do need to drive that power curve down. And while we see it 4 years away that we compete with diesel, we're not there yet. And so when you're entering a space, a very mature energy industry, you're competing with fully mature grown-up companies, and we're sort of a toddler right now, and it's hard to compete with grown-ups when you're a toddler. And so I think that's one of our big challenges, is just riding out that time and learning curve of getting our costs down where we know it can get, and staying on the playing field while we do that.
And there is also the social acceptability. Bringing a new technology into any place, you will have the question of how it works. Will it have an impact to my village, to my community, or to the neighborhood? So you have to have a good record of experience and built with it, and then the social acceptability will start to be very easy to have.
Great. Excellent. Well, we do have some questions from the audience as well. And I want to see first, they might not be able to speak. It depends on their situation. Ellen Zuras, I have unmuted you. And if you're ready, you can ask your question now yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for the excellent presentation. I'm calling in from Stockholm right now in urban planning. Nonetheless, I noticed that Canadians use half of the diesel than Americans do per capita based on the numbers that you shared earlier. Do you have any idea as to why?
That's a great question. I don't.
No worries at all. I have one other quick question. Where does your funding, I kind of chimed in 5 minutes late, so forgive me if it's a repeat. Where does your funding come from, and how do you make money from this to keep the company up and running?
Those are excellent questions. I actually had a slide on this that I took out because we had a lot of slides to go through. I didn't want to go too long, but so far our company has raised something in the neighborhood of about $90 million to support the technology we've gone through, and it's always been about a 50-50 public-private split. The public investment has largely come from the Department of Energy, but also the state of Alaska through several grant programs I talked about. Negyagik has contributed, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but that's supplied about a half of that funding. The other half has come from private investment, and it's been really important to have that balance, because we're not the kind of company that a venture capitalist is interested in. We're not going to double someone's investment in a few years. It's a long-term strategic investment, and so it takes patient capital, and it also takes leveraging of that capital, and that's what that public-private partnership really does. And it's been really consistent through our company's development by happenstance, and it just ends up being about 50-50 split.
Very
Great.
cool. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And now I have a question, or we have a question from Nat Zorek. I will unmute you. If you're able to speak, you can ask your question yourself now.
Yeah, so you mentioned servicing the unit in the winter, and I was wondering, I missed part of the presentation because I got here late, but does the river freeze? And if so, like, how do you deal with that from a standpoint of maintenance, or just thinking about how to create systems that will hold up year round?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and is one of the key important aspects of our demonstration in Negyagik in the next year is to operate through the course of the winter, which we haven't done yet. The Kwijak River there flows fast enough, and that primarily because of that, probably also because the lake is a large heat mass and cools slowly. The lake does freeze over. I was just out there. The lake was mostly frozen, but the river, the ice freezes along the shore, but the main channel stays open. And so we really saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate this technology in a place where the river doesn't freeze. There are other locations like this. I've been looking seriously at one in Canada that's a similar lake river system that doesn't freeze, largely because the currents are fast. And that's the main contributor. Where you have fast currents, the rivers don't tend to freeze over. But most rivers in the north slow down significantly in the winter because their main sources of flow go away, whether it's glacial melt or runoff. These lake systems, because they have sort of a large reservoir for flow, tend to maintain their river velocities and stay ice-free. So in Negyagik, we anticipate staying ice-free. We don't anticipate doing any operations in the winter, because the challenge we run into is no one can put their boat in the river in the wintertime because of the shore ice. I guess you could leave it in the river, but then the boat that asset becomes vulnerable, and no one wants to put their expensive Bristol Bay fishing boat out in the river to weather the whims of nature. So we're going to be leaving it underwater all winter long and letting it ride out the winter and retrieving it in the spring. At this point, if something breaks in the wintertime, we don't have a strategy to fix it.
Great.
And I should mention, it's one of the reasons why this too, not just to meet the village load, but looking at more than one device in an array becomes really important, because if we only had a single large device, we don't have redundancy. And when we have a long period of time where maintenance isn't possible, redundancy becomes really important.
Excellent. Well, it's obvious that ice is an issue, and good to hear that, because I was wondering about that too in the presentation. And regarding the question of diesel use per capita, your colleague Susie Kiss, and first of all, Susie, big thanks to you, because you basically brought this all together. You stayed a little bit in the background, and I didn't thank you properly in the beginning, so thank you for making this possible, and also for joining us today. And if you're ready to explain the difference as much as you can, I have unmuted you. I hope you're able to speak right now. Okay, maybe.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Just speaking to Ellen's question, I asked the same question of a colleague of mine who I got that data from, and she indicated that the way the US and Canada report those numbers may include, they may calculate that number differently. And so it may be a bit of comparing apples to oranges, because they don't calculate the diesel fuel use the same.
Okay, and I think I understand this really well, because I work a lot across the Atlantic, and when you compare statistics from European member states, European Union member states, to the United States, very often the statistics, the basis for the statistics may be different, so it's not always the same, even though the units look the same. So interesting point.
Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, what she told me is that the U.S. numbers may involve small businesses, or and the Canadian only residential or something like that.
Okay, great. Yeah, and that makes sense. They use a little bit more. Thank you very much, Susie. And we have quite a few more questions here. First, let's go to Palash Sanya. I hope I said this right. I have unmuted you. I have sent you an unmute request. If you're able to ask your question, you can do that now.
Yeah, I can. Hey, thank you for the presentation. It's a great one. I'm talking from Saskatchewan, Canada, and the north of Saskatchewan and in other territories. The ice would be a big issue whenever I think about it. But also, I think the economic factor of diesel, because it's very much connected. The fuel is very much connected with the food system and everything. So do you have any studies already that how that might be impacted or influenced when renewable energy comes to them?
This is Monty. I guess I don't think I completely understand your question. You talked about the diesel being interconnected. Could you just repeat that part of it? I didn't understand the connection you're trying to.
Yes. So for example, the communities depend on how the diesel goes there, because it's part of their system, economic system, because when the diesel goes in, it also takes back lumber or certain stuff back to the community. So altogether, in the economic model for Canada, do you consider those things as well?
I understand, yeah. So, I can't think of too many examples in Alaska where the diesel transportation is directly linked to something else. For instance, the planes that deliver fuel to Yagik are specifically tanker planes, so they don't backhaul waste or anything like that. Sometimes with other hauling, there is that. They'll haul in the construction supplies and they backhaul waste out of a village in a barge, for instance. So I can't think of an example where that applies, but I can think of one that's similar, and that is that in most of our communities in Alaska, they recover the waste heat from the diesel generator plant and use it to heat maybe the water treatment plant or the school, for instance. And so if you talk about turning off the diesels, while that's great and saves diesel fuel, suddenly there's a heating source that's taken away as well. And so one of the things we've looked at is when we do talk about taking away the diesel generation, we need to have done it at a time when we're producing more energy than the community is using, enough so that we can replace that heating load as well. And so there are things like that that are interconnected for sure in how the diesel is used. But for Alaska, and while I'm sure there are cases, it's not the norm that the diesel supply is linked to a community business that it becomes essential for. Certainly, there would be a fuel supplier that might need to think about a different way of making their money, the gas station, so to speak, for the power plant. But in Igiugig, for instance, they're not concerned about that, fuel sales going away because they know it'll be replaced by service contracts for the device itself.
Yeah, Monty, you pointed that out earlier, the huge benefit, the local value creation. And I think if we look at it from an economics point of view, with diesel, you basically have a permanent outflow of money out of the community to the people who actually have the added value from refining the oil to diesel, but also to people who are selling the oil initially. And this now is money that can stay there. That's why I always think if we look at the levelized cost of energy, that's of course a true number, but not only is the question how high is that number, but also who gets the money, right? That's the second question behind that. And I think it's so interesting because of course, obviously there is money flowing out. You manufacture components in Maine and around it and ship it. So it's not all local, but a lot more is local. And employment, but also the maintenance and the installation, but also then the reduction in the fuel cost later. And I think that's really interesting. I come from economics, so that's kind of my angle of looking at this. I find this extremely interesting in terms of also making the local economy resilient, right? So we talk about energy resilience, but I also think we can also add like economic resilience as one part there, because if ever we see a spike in diesel costs again, and we all remember 2008 when oil prices went up. This hurts economies that depend really on importing oil. I think that can be very, very beneficial in the long run, when we have these shocks.
And also not to forget the environmental resilience as well.
Oh yeah. So we're almost done. We have 2 minutes left, and I don't have it. So Ellen Zuras has another question. I think she maybe can ask the question herself. That might be the best way. I have unmuted you, Ellen. You can ask your question now.
Thanks again, guys. Question regarding if you've seen any changes in funding or really, what's the word? Just any sort of changes as a company with the Trump administration?
Yeah, it's a good question. On the federal level, a bit surprisingly, I would say, the budget for the water power program at DOE has actually gone up these last couple of years. And I think that's largely because of champions in the Senate. Alaska's Senator Murkowski has been a big proponent of the water power program, and it doesn't just fund marine hydrokinetics, but also advanced traditional hydropower technologies. So that budget has actually increased the last couple of years, and so we haven't seen the federal funding take a downturn yet. I think we've also seen a little bit more appetite on the private investment side, maybe because of the perception the federal government won't be as supportive of this industry and there has been more interest from the private investment side. So it's kind of been a bit of a surprise, but I wouldn't say we've seen a downturn in that.
Cool, thanks.
That's very good news, and good to end the webinar on this positive note. I want to say thank you very, very much, both for the webinar, but also for the work you're doing. I think it's really amazing. I hope that this will really see a lot of uptake in the coming years. We all heard statistics or reports about how little time we have to decarbonize our economy. And I think, well, yeah, here's actually a system that works, that's proven to work, that answers a direct need and has a use case. And there are people who actually know what they're doing, meaning you. And I think it's amazing to see that. It's a wonderful project, and I hope that you will get a lot more projects in the water very soon. I want to thank you, Monty, Guillaume, and also Susie for participating, for making this possible. I want to thank all of the participants for joining in, for asking questions. And again, this is an Energy Future Exchange webinar. You can find the recordings on our website, energyfuturex.org, later on. And I hope we can stay in touch and continue the discussion online and in person, and wish you all a great remainder of your day today. And also, since the weekend is very close, hopefully a very relaxing weekend very soon, and hope to see you soon again. The next Energy Future Exchange webinar is already next week on February 7th, same time. I was going to say same place, but it's of course online, so that's the same. And it's going to be about an energy cooperative, so a nonprofit energy company in Croatia called ZEZ. It's a Croatian acronym, so don't ask me what this stands for. It's very interesting. Their technology is mostly solar, so it's radically different, but it's very interesting as well. It's a young company, a small company, and I hope it's going to be interesting both for the Europeans and also for the Americans. So maybe Monty, Guillaume, maybe you even are interested in joining. So again, it will be next Thursday, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Look forward to continuing the discussion, and thank you again very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you about this.